Welcome to our discussion today, which is talking about our demands for the Senedd election manifestos with regard to health and social care. I'm sure most of you are aware that there are expectations as far as the provision of health and social care are concerned in Welsh, but there's no legal requirement. And what's become obvious over recent months is whether we're talking about mental health services, services for young children, or people living with dementia, there is a gap between the demand for services in the Welsh language and service provision. And that often affects the quality of the service that's available to Welsh speakers. It's an issue that is a challenge for all minority languages. So we've taken the opportunity today to speak to the language commissioners in New Brunswick and Ontario in Canada, who at a federal and provincial level have been dealing with these same issues for many years, just to see whether we can learn from their experiences, and also to get some kind of flavour as to the increase that they've seen, if any, in the provision of language services in health and social care through the medium of French. Bonjour Kelly et Shirley, merci pour votre participation. I'd like to welcome Kelly Burke from Ontario and Shirley McLean from New Brunswick, who hopefully will give us an insight into language rights within the Canadian health and social care system. And I'd just like, Kelly, first of all, for you to explain the situation currently in Ontario with regard to language rights, and whether, as a French speaker in Ontario currently, you would be able to insist or even rely on the fact that some care would be provided for you within your language of choice.
Alors, bonjour Aled, un grand plaisir d'être ici et de participer ce matin. Great pleasure to be with you this morning and to participate in this dialogue. As the French Language Services Commissioner in Ontario, my role is to ensure that services are provided in French to the French-speaking population. As it pertains to healthcare, the government generally has obligation, the provincial government generally has obligation to provide healthcare services in French, primarily communication services, and that rendered much easier through our electronic means. And for the most part, ministries responsible for healthcare and long-term care do in fact provide services in French through that medium. So the French-speaking population clearly accessing that information readily through the electronic means. A little different from what you described in Wales in terms of whether the primary caregivers, or primary, I think you called it, care, doctors and dentists' offices, they are not subject to the French Language Services Act. So the healthcare services provided by the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, ministries, there are two of them, that doesn't apply to services provided by doctors or dentists. Although dentists and doctors do provide services in French, it's not provided on a mandatory basis pursuant to the French Language Services Act. In terms of secondary care, hospitals that are designated under the French Language Services Act, so identified as hospitals that provide services in French, would be required to provide services within those designated areas that the hospital would have identified at the time it became designated. So there's francophones who would go to those hospitals to ask for and perhaps even actively offered services in French from those hospitals. But for the most part, the French Language Services Act applies to the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Long-Term Care for the services that they provide, which isn't direct healthcare services to the public.
Okay, thanks. And Shirley, is the situation similar in New Brunswick? I'm sure people in Wales would be unaware really of the linguistic differences between provinces in Canada, but are your rights within your health and care services dependent on the same legislation?
We're somewhat different. Pour commencer, ça me fait plaisir de participer aujourd'hui. Merci beaucoup pour l'invitation. We're similar yet dissimilar to Ontario, as you may or may not know, or the people that will be listening to this potentially may or may not know. New Brunswick, the province of New Brunswick in Canada, is the only officially bilingual province in the country. So our Official Languages Act applies to all government institutions, and unlike Kelly in Ontario, there are no non-designated hospitals, so healthcare services from hospitals are people do have access to services in the language of their choice. Like Ontario, private or what you refer to as primary health care, doctors, optometrists, dentists, no, those are private services, what we term private healthcare services, and there's no obligation on private organizations or healthcare providers to provide service in the language of choice. But there's also, so when we talk about what you refer to, I think, as secondary services, hospitals, that includes nursing homes here, ambulance services. New Brunswickers have the right to be served in the language of their choice from the outset, and that includes the active offer. From the moment you step foot in a hospital, the institution, the hospital, the healthcare provider has the obligation under our Act to meet the person with an offer of being able to choose the language of their choice. Hello, bonjour, and the member of the public has the opportunity to choose their language. Another interesting part of our Act as well is that third parties, it also covers third parties. So I use the example now under COVID. If you go to a hospital, everyone gets these screening questions, and initially those aren't healthcare workers, but they're there, they're doing screening, and they're generally, in some cases, security staff that have been hired by the Department of Health to conduct those questions, or another organization, some sort of third party. So those third parties also have the same obligations under the Act because they have been contracted by the institution to provide that service for the institution. So the obligation also resides there as well. So if the member of the public goes for the screening questions, they are to have the opportunity, they should be provided the active offer, they are to be provided the active offer and be able to proceed through the whole process in the official language of their choice.
So New Brunswick seems a bit more similar to the situation we have here, where there aren't designations. The expectation is the same wherever you are. Would you say then that the active offer has taken root? Because although we have talk of the active offer here, perhaps the reality is somewhat different currently here?
The active offer has taken root, yes, but it's problematic. It has taken root because and I've only been doing this for a year, but personally, I've lived in New Brunswick for over 30 years, and I've seen it because I've had healthcare issues myself. I'm a cancer survivor, so it's problematic. It has taken root because the institution clearly recognizes, when we receive complaints, clearly recognize that they have the obligation to do so. But we do continue to receive complaints about it. But to my view, it clearly has taken root. The institutions continue to have problems making the active offer, and once the active offer is given, obviously there has to be continuity of care in the language of choice of the individual, and sometimes that's problematic in the process as well. But certainly the institution is aware of the obligation. Whether A, they have the staff, the bilingual staff, to be able to provide it is an issue. And B, unfortunately, what I'm seeing and have seen even as a member of the province of New Brunswick or a member of the public is that sometimes there's an organizational culture and certain institutions that there's a failure for that to take root. Why that is, I don't know. But certainly as an obligation, it's recognized, understood, and the institution certainly is aware of it and are willing to work with us to make sure that it works.
and Kelly, turning to Ontario, it's almost as if you make an active choice as a patient yourself. That if you want a French language service, that you actually go to a designated hospital, for example. So how real is the offer within those institutions? Is it pretty assured? And just so that we understand, because the system here is very different, if I was a French speaker, for example, in an area where there were no designated facilities, would it be the case then that I would have to obtain services in a different area, or do I just have to accept the reality of the situation in which I live?
Well, in many ways, you would be accepting the reality of the situation in the area in which you live. Not only are institutions designated pursuant to the French Language Services Act, but regions in the province of Ontario are also designated. So it's not every region in the province that is designated and would recognize the need to provide services in French in areas that are not designated. You know, our key jurisdiction, I would say, in the province where the French language is very prevalent and where there are hospitals that are designated, one in particular in Ottawa, the nation's capital, there is an active offer of service. There is a recognition that the French language has to be provided either upon request or active offer. I think in principle, active offer is very much present in the organizations that are designated, but I would surely recognize that in many institutions it wouldn't be actively offered, but rather upon request.
Okay.
In Ottawa, I think active offer is much more prevalent than it would be elsewhere. Just to be clear, Aled, with regard to the possibility of obtaining services in French, I made reference to the technology and how that is advancing the interests of active offer and provision of service electronically or virtually. I would see that more and more we will be able to, in the province of Ontario, provide services virtually, even in areas that are not designated. And even if the institutions themselves are not located in the area where the person, the citizen, would want to obtain those services in French. Physically, that would be a different story.
Yeah, and of course, the whole experience of COVID makes this interesting, doesn't it? Because the health service and care service themselves are probably talking about whether they move to a more virtual service in certain instances, which I think for all minority languages actually sort of gives us opportunity.
Yes.
You've both referred to organisational approach or standing. You've both referred to the challenge as far as the bilingual workforce is concerned, which are certainly issues that we recognise here. Are there any other issues that you feel that are a challenge for what you're seeking to achieve in both your provinces?
Perhaps I'll just jump in, Shirley. One of the challenges, I think, the recruitment of skilled labor, not only in language, but also in subject matter. So in Ontario, we put a lot of emphasis on enhancing our post-secondary programming so that students have an opportunity to further their education in French at a post-secondary level. A challenge, I would say, generally in ensuring that the services that the province wants to provide in French, the province is actually able to provide them with those skills that are so badly needed. So I think one of the questions that was asked, what is one of our biggest challenges? I would say recruitment of skilled people and ensuring that the programming that is available at the post-secondary level is responsive to the needs of our labor force.
Similar to that in New Brunswick, because we have a number of rural, we have 3 larger urban centers, 3 to 4 urban centers, let's say, and then we have a number of rural hospitals. and even in the like if you take there's a city in Edmonton, which is northern New Brunswick. It's a city, but it's still fairly remote. It's 3 hours from the capital city. It's and if you take Bathurst, which is what we call it's on the Acadian Peninsula, it's far from other services. So when you're recruiting medical professionals, again, it's a recruitment issue. You might be able to recruit them to come to the larger centers, the larger cities, Fredericton, Moncton, St. John, but to get a specialty into a remote hospital in a fairly small community, and then a francophone or bilingual professional, again, it provides, I find it adds another level of difficulty to recruitment. I don't know, it's probably the same in Ontario as well, Northern
Very
Ontario,
much
those
so.
types of places, yeah.
Very much so, yes.
Yeah.
And just so that we understand, because we recognise those same recruitment issues, we also recognise the challenge of actually ensuring that you have education and training opportunities post 16 in Welsh. But our recruitment currently and the responsibility as far as workforce planning is concerned, although the expectation is raised at national level, the responsibility is at area health board level. Is that the same for yourselves? So would you see differences? Surely you were talking about sort of, the challenges within rural communities, or is that done at state or province level as far as you're concerned?
The province is responsible overall for it, but has regional coordination for that in terms of recruitment, and some are frankly more successful than others. And for example, in the capital city, it seems like our recruitment process is a little bit less successful than for physicians, for example. For whatever reason why that is, I'm not sure. But so overall, it's the province that is responsible for it, but they hire these recruiters who, or they're not, I don't know how much support they have, probably not a whole lot. They don't have a whole lot. So they're as successful as they can be. So there's not a lot of support there, really.
In Ontario, there is that, say, service delivery at the local level that permeates the Ontario system, in that the Ministry of Health province-wide has overall jurisdiction on healthcare in the province. Not direct healthcare to patients, though. But all of the areas, different areas of the province have local health units. And so the local health units are responsible for administering health care, although maybe not directly, because some doctors' offices, as we mentioned earlier, and dentists, etc., they operate in a private environment. But local healthcare units are not covered by the French Language Services Act. So that means that provincially, we will have an obligation on the part of the Ministry of Health to be providing information to the public with regard to healthcare needs. But once that is then delegated through the system at the local level, the local health units don't have that obligation. So as Commissioner, I look to see application of French Language Services Act on a first level basis to see if I have jurisdiction to impose a requirement that they provide services in French. In this particular instance, even the distribution of vaccines for COVID has been delegated to the local health units. Local health units do not have an obligation to provide services in French. I take the position that regardless of whether or not they have that obligation, it's the right thing to do in a province the size of Ontario that has a population that exceeds 450,000 francophones. So that is a challenge for us, Aled, as far as distribution of medical health information from a medical perspective on the local level.
Okay. And just to add a little bit in terms of recruitment, the difference, there would be an extreme difference between Kelly's province and my own, in that Ontario is sort of the center of the universe for Canada. So everybody wants to work and live in Ontario. So for them, it's, it would be easier to attract healthcare professionals too. Whereas Atlantic Canada is more known to be more rural. It's not the center of the universe. Where the but one thing is during COVID, one of the phenomena that we've been noting is that people are leaving Ontario and Quebec, the larger population provinces, to come here. They will buy houses sight unseen because we've had a very, very good experience due to under COVID, because we've had very relatively low cases. We're all working in our offices. We go out to restaurants. We've had some éclosion. We've had some breakouts, but relatively it's been very, very well. We've had very good life here, and so it has attracted immigrants from other provinces for that reason. So we're hoping that maybe that will translate to the healthcare professional sphere as well.
And I understand that argument because I live in Rhos Llanelli, which is the centre of the universe as far as Wales is concerned. So there we go.
Yeah.
Looking at the provision of services on the ground, we've got quite a live discussion here at the moment regarding the impact of not providing services in the language of choice on quality of care and clinical assessments. We have cases where people who are living with dementia, for example, who are assessed in their second language, scoring lower than they might do in their mother tongue. So in Canada, if you've made your active choice in whatever way it is, would the clinical assessment be guaranteed to be undertaken in that language of choice? Or is it done bilingually as far as forms and the actual assessment is concerned? Because one of the issues we have currently is, a relatively small minority language, certainly larger than most European minority languages, but still, in the scale of things, is a lot of these assessments are international. And it's the actual challenge of even sort of, translating and ensuring that the standard of translation is acceptable to the clinicians.
Mm-hmm. In New Brunswick, technically the requirement would be there for care A to Z in the language of choice of the individual, be it forms, be it any sort of assessment. We do see complaints. We do see that fall through the cracks. Also, we have the added phenomena. For example, in the province next to us, Nova Scotia, has a couple of centers of care that we do not have here in New Brunswick. For example, if you're doing a transplant, an organ transplant of some kind, a large majority of those cases would be done in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So if a patient is getting assessed in that world, they're going to receive forms and documentation a Francophone's going to receive them in English. And we've gotten those complaints. So what's the obligation there? Well, there is a certain obligation on the institution because that member of the public is a member of our healthcare institution. And it's not under our act, but there's also a Medical Records Act in New Brunswick that there's some obligation of the institution to provide translation of some of this documentation, but I would turn to the institution and put that obligation on them as well, because it's part of the continuity of care in our view.
Kelly?
In Ontario, it would be more on a case-by-case basis. Clearly, the Ministry of Health has the obligation to make forms available in both languages, if in fact it is the Ministry of Health that's issuing these kinds of documents for the general public to fill out. But if it's in an area of the province where the service that's being sought is being acquired in an environment that does not have a designation, the hospital perhaps that's administering the treatment does not have a designation, all of that would be conducted in English. Again, coming back to our virtual world, I think that will evolve. But for the most part, the services that you described would be provided primarily in English. In the designated area and through a say a secondary, if I use your terminology, secondary provider, hospitals, designated, you could expect that your service would be in French. If asked for that, there are variances even in that environment, depending on the kind of treatment that you're looking for and the resources available to provide it. So very much on a case-by-case basis, and I think one of the things that I've noticed in my practice in the last while, it's one thing to have the forms available in French, and you undergo a treatment with a French-speaking practitioner. The results of that test might not be in the language of choice. It might be in the English language, subject to perhaps a translation or an interpretation by a practitioner when you meet face-to-face with your doctor.
Okay, thanks. Whole purpose of these podcasts really is to open discussion, to learn from international best practice. We've discussed some of the challenges that we have here in Wales. Based on your own experiences, what would you set out as being the priorities as far as sort of ensuring the provision of these services in the language of your choice in Wales as we go forward? Where would you prioritise action by any incoming government?
If the decision is made that these services or the active offer, or made a decision that this is going to be provided, I think ongoing education of staff in these institutions on an ongoing basis is very necessary. Education as to what it is, what it means, what the requirement is, what the obligation is, and why. You know, it's a matter of respect. It's a matter of, it's a, it's a dearly held right, and that's something that has to be continuous, because we find that if that's not done, it can tend to fall away, that they feel there's not a requirement. One of the things I was surprised about when we did start in COVID, we were doing the screening questions, when you go to a hospital, for example, my son's girlfriend, she's in nursing school, and she went to the hospital here, and they wanted to hire her to be part of the screening team. This was at, the opening days of COVID, and she went and she did her training. They didn't even talk about the active offer. Right. She happened to be her son, her boyfriend had to be the son of the Commissioner of Official Languages. Well, I was able to tell them that. I met with the CEO and I said, look, and they freely admitted that fell through the cracks, and they've repaired that. But it's not just a one-time thing, it has to continue, because people have to be constantly reminded. Like, we're in Fredericton, the capital city, which tends to be an Anglophone city. It's an Anglophone city. And, I find the hospital here, you have to continually remind Horizon, our healthcare provider, that this training has to continue. And the reminders, and that has to be in place.
Yeah, I'll just leap with Shirley on that front. Absolutely, the ongoing education is critical to ensure that people know where their obligations lie with regard to delivering services in French, particularly in our designated institutions. I think one of the key pieces that Shirley has made reference to is us to ensure that all policies that government is developing anticipate the need for ongoing education, but that they be developed with a Francophone lens. And so we very much make a recommendation to government on an ongoing basis to ensure that every policy that we're developing in healthcare and general care, where the French Language Services Act applies, that the Francophone lens be applied to all of that policy development, and right from the outset, so that it's not an afterthought. Another piece that I highlighted in my annual report is the whole notion of planning for French language services, and that comes back to the Francophone lens, but it also comes back to an obligation on the part of the higher echelons of government to plan for these services, human resources to support them, and the overall quality of services that has to be at the root of what it is we're trying to achieve. It's one thing to have services available, it's another thing to have quality services available. So we very much put quite a bit of emphasis on quality. Another aspect that is critically important in Ontario is an advisory board to the Ministry of Health. It is a French language advisory board that is in place, comprised of a number of people from the general health community that comes together probably on a quarterly basis and meets with the minister and her team in the public service to talk about French language service delivery and how it can be enhanced, what policies need to be put in place. And it gives the government a very good read on what's happening on the ground. And so that is something that I would very much recommend, is an advisory team coming in and advising the minister regularly on the delivery of French language services.
Merci, Shirley Kelly. I think this discussion this afternoon has shown really that the challenges for us all are very similar as far as health and social care are concerned. And whether it's in Ontario or New Brunswick, many of the things that we need to address in order to ensure that Welsh speakers in our situation receive services in their preferred language is a reality going forward.